know from other publications from Bruton and major scholars in women and gender studies that if we follow the rabbinical sources or even non-Jewish texts like the New Testament or other literary sources, sometimes we get a false idea about the role and status of women, especially during late antiquity. Meaning that in rabbinical sources, a lot of times women are portrayed as, helping men or being like away from social and religious life, as opposed to the archaeological evidence that they come into life and they portray a different view. However, we cannot unanimously say that this is actually something that it was applied to all cases. By all means, we are dealing with a society that is mostly patriarchic. However, and this is really, really important, women played a significant role in the society, on everyday life, and also in the religious life, which was something, if we study texts or if we see even the art from the 6th century CE and onwards, that would seem to be like impossible. However, through this publication, we have come to actually examine and see that women, and especially of course Jewish tombstones are very, very important. Of course, they're always portrayed or they recognized or identified by their husband or their brother's name or the family name. For instance, in Larissa, in Thessaly, we have several tombstones that they are referring to Maria or Sarah or Anna, but they're always identified as the wife of Judah or the wife of Leon. Of course, I'm translating the names into English because, Greek Jews and like elsewhere, they used to transliterate their names into Greek so as to sound more appealing to the external environment, such as Leon became Leodiskos, which is the same, or Mazal Tov became Ephichia, meaning good luck in Greece. But it was, they want to assimilate into their external environment, so it was more easy to find an equivalent name. There was a huge publication, I'm sure some of you are familiar, by Tali Lan, that she wrote about Jewish names in late antiquity, and we have all the bibliography about, especially about women's name. So the majority of the inscriptions that we came across identify women as, like I said, the sister or the wife of someone, and they usually, their identity is also identified either by inscribing the menorah or by the husband's name. Usually they text reads and they say that he comes from Judea or he's a Samaritan. Have in mind that we don't have still the schism between Jews and Samaritans, so they are both for the external environment, Romans and Greeks and Romans, they are considered to be as one. Even though we know from the 2nd century BCE, from Delos, that Jews and Samaritans were portraying themselves, they differentiate themselves. Jews were called Jews and Samaritans called themselves Israelites, so as to differentiate themselves from the local community. However, they are examples of inscriptions that we came across. There is an example, I have a slide to show you, that most of the times women were buried together with their family members, and there is an instance where we have a poem that comes from Homer, and that shows probably that women, and of course that meant that high, not middle class but upper class women, got a Greek education. And of course we know from the Talmud that it was kosher to study also Homer. And there is a very, very interesting and moving two verses that speak about her dying before she got married. That showed that probably she was well educated among her community, and that showed, of course, it is not unusual for women to get educated, but inside the house. We don't know exactly if they were supposed to get, a significant role in the community, but then we came across an inscription that comes from Gordon, Crete, that bears the name of Sophia, head of the synagogue and keeper of the synagogue. Yeah, I'm really, really sorry I cannot show it to you. We know from Jewish epigraphy that we have two more examples from Asia Minor and Rome, that they are referring to the role of, they are referring to a head of a synagogue. In Greek it's called Archisynagogissa. And then, of course, she is also portrayed as the wife of an elder. And this is really, really important because, and I'm quoting also Bruton, who has done the role of females in synagogues and their functions, that, again, if we read only rabbinical sources, that would be unspeakable for someone to be head of the synagogue. However, in late antiquity, that was also very common. And we know, especially if we compare with inscriptions from Asia Minor and Rome, that Jewish women, especially wealthy Jewish women, were major donors in the synagogue. Sometimes one of their functions, which is really, really difficult to actually identify, and that's also the case for men's title or honorific titles or functions, to actually identify what was the real function of the title. But the researchers and scholars assume that they were in charge of collecting the money for the synagogue. They were in charge of teaching and preaching, or also calling the members of the community to read the parasha and study the Torah. This is really, really important in a time where, of course, Jewish women were living side by side with other communities, and sometimes their role was non-existent. Like in the Greek society, women were isolated in the house, and their aim was only to bear children and take care of the house. We do know, of course, that there was a minority that was in the temples. However, in Judaism, it's completely different, the idea of women and how they participate in the synagogue, and, of course, the organization of women inside the community. There are other examples. This is really, really important. There are other examples, I'm really, really sorry, of women being freed because they were Jewish slaves, and it's really important that the text reads that the women were actually freed from their masters, and they became totally free to own themselves, which is really something that it was not used to, that was not the case during antiquity. And of course, we cannot follow up the role and the function of those women and how they actually continue their lives, but in any case, that shows that women were capable of owning their own identity and their own role inside the society. It's really, really important when we study, especially the role and function of women, and especially Jewish women. We have to always look at their external environment and their relationships with either the Greek, Roman, or later on Byzantine surroundings and culture. They were, of course, cases, and this is really, really also interesting, that we found of mixed marriage, which is again through the rabbinical sources and, of course, imperial also legal documents, was forbidden. And at some point, the punishment for a mixed marriage was also death. So yeah, that was forbidden, and that was the notion, especially in the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, because it was at the beginning of the expansion of the empire. They wanna, they wanna set the status of the Christianity ad hoc. So whenever they saw, because Judaism was very appealing also to non-Jews, especially in societies in decline. And I have to quote also Plato, who was really the Torah was appealing to him. He has studied probably the Torah, or he was familiar with some verses when he visited the library of Alexandria, because at the 3rd century BCE, of course, the Torah was also translated into Greek, so it was available to other cultures. So Judaism, especially in societies in decline, because of its moral ethics and way of life, was very appealing when people wanted to have something strong and solid to hang on, especially in societies that morality or values were declining, and they want to have a more of a central, or let's say a more of a scope to their life. So yeah, I'm really sorry I cannot show you the inscriptions that I wanted to. However, it's very difficult, and we know that from other also cases that it's really difficult to actually make conclusions about the role and function of women, aside of course from the well-known roles they have in the family or in their community. However, we came across several inscriptions that portray something different from the literary sources. So whenever, and this is something new when we are dealing with women's and gender studies, that we have to have a combination of the literary sources and of the archaeological sources. And especially the archaeological sources, because it is more close to everyday life, especially Jewish epigraphy or the art, portrays and shows in a most vivid way the reality. Even though in some cases it refers to social, to higher or higher classes women, however, we can see the differences between the literary sources. Another thing that is really interesting is that women, in a lot of cases, and especially non-Jewish women, but also Jewish women, were major donors in the synagogue. And at some point, they kept the community's life vivid and alive. And we know, again, especially from lamps that they were found in synagogues, that they were also trying to find money for the community. They were collecting also money for the temple when they had the shekel, for the yearly shekel for the temple. And we know that those women were well respected by men. However, there are more things that we need to find about, especially about the function of titles and honorific titles of women, that they are being placed upon as we read the text, especially from inscriptions. And at any point we cannot say that they were totally free or they acted, like men. However, archaeology shows us that probably women had a totally different status when it came, especially, which is really important, especially into religious life. I think if that power comes back, I can show you briefly the inscriptions, and if you have any questions, I'm here for you. Thank you.